Read between the lines. It's a common idiom used to explain the process of inferring things that aren't explicitly said. But when it comes to manga and comics, you quite literally have to read between the lines. This space, right here, between each panel, is called the gutter. It acts like a magical dimension where anything can happen. I don't know who coined such an unappealing term for the space between panels, but gutters are crucial in manga and every form of sequential storytelling. It's the glue that allows us to construct a scene depending on the arrangement of the drawings. You see, as humans, we don't need to experience something with our senses to realize that it's there. It's not like you can look away at something and it disappears. If you close your eyes right now and mute the audio, whatever you're using to watch this video is still there. Same thing with Bangladesh, for example. I've never been there, but I have faith that it exists. We might think we are perceiving the world as a whole with our five senses, but in reality, we are only seeing an infinitesimal fraction of the universe. The same concept applies to manga. If you look at this panel, you can safely assume that this boy, Denji, still has the rest of his body. It's just not shown. If you see these two panels of Denji putting a cigarette in his mouth and eating it, you're not shown all the in-between panels of his hand moving. It's reasonable to assume that it happens though. You, the reader, construct the motion yourself. Well, when it comes to reading manga, a lot of people will comment how amazing the art is, but nobody seems to talk about the empty space. And why would they? It's blank. Nothing to see here, right? But by the end of this video, I guarantee I'll be able to convince you that the best art doesn't come from Kentaro Miura's Berserk or Yusuke Murata's One Punch Man. No, the best artwork comes from chapter 283 of Shaman King, which depicts the main character's ultimate move. 2 blank pages. In essence, the real meat of manga isn't in the drawings. The real story is in what we don't see. The blood is in the gutters. In the book Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, he defines the process of piecing together fragmented information as closure. This book was written in 1994, but most of its concepts still pertain even after 3 whole decades. In terms of manga, closure helps us interpret these separate images as things that are connected in place and time. Every day we use closure to mentally complete things that are physically incomplete. There are many different types. Look at this smiley face, for example. It's just a few lines that are put together, but it triggers a mental sense of closure. We perceive these lines as a face. The same concept can be applied to the phenomenon known as pareidolia, in which we see meaningful images in non-related things, like seeing a face on the moon. By extrapolation, a more elaborately drawn face also triggers closure, but on a more grounded level, rather than something more abstract. After all, a drawing is just a representation, it's not the real thing. Other times, we barely need any detail to form closure. Strong silhouettes are the hallmark of a great character design, allowing us to easily tell what we're looking at. Another form of closure is tiny dots, or a more fancy term, halftones. When you put a bunch of them together, the human brain reads these screen tones as shades of gray, even though all the dots are black. Manga uses halftones rather than shades of gray because it saves on printing costs, allowing magazines to get a wide variety of shades while using only one color. In addition to the use of recycled paper, this is how Shonen Jump volumes in Japan are only 250 yen, or about $1.6. Closure is also used in anime and film at a rate of 24 frames per second. When enough images are shown in quick succession, our minds automatically perceive the pictures to be moving. But if you delve deeper, even a screen is just a bunch of tiny colored dots that we perceive as one whole image. It's closure within closure. To put it together, closure is a form of Gestalt psychology, the school of thought revolving around the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you have all the parts of a bicycle in one spot, it's not really a bike. You have to put it all together, and once you do, you're not going to be focusing on any individual pieces. You'll focus on the bike as a whole. While closure happens mostly subconsciously in anime, it's very different in manga. The audience is both willing and conscious, fabricating the concepts of time and motion in their own minds. Of course, this process happens nearly instantaneously in the gutter. Look at this set of panels, once again coming from Understanding Comics. Here you have a man swinging an axe into another man. Then the next panel cuts away to a scream. What do you think happened between the two panels? The likely answer is that you imagined the attacker swinging the axe, killing or injuring the victim. If that's what you imagined, the artist wasn't the one who created the murder. Technically, it was you, the reader, letting the axe drop. You're also the one who decides how hard, how fast, and where the axe hits. In a sense, you're complicit in committing the crime. As Scott McCloud writes, to kill a man between panels is to condemn him to 1,000 deaths. You can also make the argument that the film medium does something similar, like when a character shoots a gun and we cut away, leaving only the sound of the shot. but manga forces closure much more often. Every panel requires the reader's direct involvement, whether it be something simple, like a character walking on a street, or someone deflecting a bullet with a cough drop. The only thing that surpasses manga and comics in the use of closure are novels, but words are gross, so I won't talk about them. Though I will make an exception for the new Brandon Sanderson book, because you totally should be reading the Stormlight Archive. In any case, we've gotten the concept of closure out of the way, so it's time to talk about all the different methods that an artist can transition from one panel to another. There are 6 main ways to transition between panels. The first type is moment to moment. As the name would suggest, these panels depict 2 moments that are relatively small in magnitude and close to each other on the timeline. It's like a short blink between 2 seconds of a film. If it's used too often, it can make a scene feel slow and dull, but when used in the right moments, it can greatly enhance drama. Tatsuki Fujimoto uses this transition very often to create a cinematic feel to his scenes. In this page, Fujimoto depicts Aki and Denji walking through a crowded street in Tokyo. The 3 moment-to-moment panels slow down time, putting emphasis on the walking that happens between the pieces of dialogue. It adds a layer of introspection for the characters. You've also got this set of panels depicting a devil as it slowly smiles. Each panel is a minute shift, highlighting the change in expression. The second type of transition is action to action, a close relative to the moment-to-moment transition, where the focus is between 2 changing actions. It's pretty obvious that you'd see this in fight scenes, as characters bob, weave, and launch attacks. An artist must strike a balance between what to depict and what to leave out, because even small mistakes can make it difficult to understand what happens between actions. As much as I love Tokyo Ghoul, I'm sure anybody who's read the manga knows how hard it can be to understand some of the more chaotic fight scenes. But when an artist is able to craft a great fight scene, it reads effortlessly. One of my favorite manga, Love Bullet, does this to perfection. In this fight scene, you have a 2v2 fight between cupids with guns. When it starts off, each side has one person run ahead, while the other stays back to provide cover fire. Koharu shoots her handgun at Chiyo, but Chiyo dodges it, crouches under Chiyo's gun, and knocks aside her arm. As Chiyo goes to shoot, Koharu dodges in the nick of time. Unfortunately, it puts her in a vulnerable position, allowing Chiyo to twist her arm. Chiyo is then able to get a clear shot of a couple of high schoolers eating at McDonald's. Why is a gun-wielding cupid trying to shoot someone at McDonald's? Well, maybe you'll just have to read the manga to find out. The third type of transition is subject to subject. This is a very common progression that allows the artist to depict different subjects within the same scene. This is the type of paneling you'd most often see for conversations, allowing the artist to depict dialogue and expressions of different characters. The fourth type of transition is scene to scene, and it requires a bit of deductive reasoning because it transports the reader between significant distances of time and or space. It's almost identical to scene transitions in film. Most artists will try to start and end scenes around a page turn, but sometimes it's necessary to change scenes in the middle of a page. Doing so requires a proper establishing shot for a smooth transition. Some artists, especially Hajime Isayama, like to use a technique where they cut one end of a large panel into progressively smaller parts, creating the feeling of a fade. In Chapter 1 of Attack on Titan, he does this 4 times, actually. The fifth type of transition is aspect to aspect, which is my personal favorite. It shows key details in the scene, allowing the reader to soak in the story. You see this type of paneling in many slice-of-life manga that try to capture a mood or atmosphere. My favorite slice-of-life manga, Blam, uses tons of aspect to aspect transitions for world building. You can really get a sense of the architecture and the people that live in this hostile world. Usually, this transition doesn't involve time, simply depicting details for the sake of setting the scene. The sixth type of transition is the non sequitur. This type of transition occurs when you have 2 panels that have no logical relationship with each other. Due to the narrative structure of manga, you're basically never going to find this in the wild. Even the most random, out-of-context moments are still part of a larger narrative. If anybody can find an example, please write it in the comments because non-sequiturs seem impossible to find. But the weird thing about non-sequiturs is that they beg a question. Can any sequence of images actually be unrelated? By virtue of 2 images being next to each other, the artist is making a statement, and therefore the reader will naturally come to a logical conclusion to piece together an overall meaning. In that sense, the non sequitur is a paradox. The 6 main types of panel transitions are not an exact science by any means. They work reasonably well, and I like how they're organized, but sometimes the categorization of a transition can be ambiguous. You run into a lot of problems, like what really differentiates a moment-to-moment transition from an action-to-action? Technically, a lot of moment-to-moment things portray an action, and a lot of actions portray events that happen in quick, momentary successions. And in other times, aspect to aspect can be indistinguishable from subject to subject. If you have a bunch of characters talking and you suddenly have an insert shot in the middle of the conversation, would that be considered an aspect of the scene, or just another subject? Well, time is passing between these panels, so I would assume subject to subject, but it's weird. Is there a better way to explain the different types of closure? Well, I did some digging, and someone else actually created a different form of categorization. Chris Gavler, in his article titled What It Really Takes to Get From Here to There. In collaboration with his colleague, Nathaniel Goldberg, he created 4 types of closure to more easily explain what actually happens between panels. The first is spatial closure. This transition involves drawing separate images of subjects that exist in a physical relationship with each other. This encompasses what Scott McCloud calls aspect to aspect, subject to subject, and some scene to scene transitions. The second is temporal closure. In this transition, the space between the panels implies that a set amount of time has passed where something could have occurred. This mainly includes moment to moment and action to action, but it can also include some subject to subject and scene to scene transitions. The third type is causal closure, where the gutter implies that some events caused an effect in the next panel. This type of closure doesn't incorporate any of Scott McCloud's pre-existing types. The fourth type of closure is associative, in which a metaphorical relationship is established between 2 images. You see this type of transition in many sports manga that have to explain character talents in an interesting way, so they use metaphorical depictions, like in Blue Lock, where Isagi Yoichi is shown to think with puzzle pieces. Putting it all together, let's look at one of my favorite comedy manga, The Voynich Hotel. The first page starts with a hand ringing a desk bell. The next panel shows a full shot of the man ringing the bell. It's the main character, Kazuki Taizo. The type of closure that happens between these panels is temporal, as a moment of time has passed between the 2 panels representing the man's action. The next 2 panels are temporal as well, but the transition between the 4th and 5th panels is spatial, establishing this furniture as being in the same room as Taizo. Similarly, the transition to the final panel is spatial as well, depicting the main setting of the manga, the titular Voynich Hotel. Here is another page, a little later in the same chapter, where we're introduced to the maids, Elena and Belluna. Once again, most of these panels utilize a simple temporal transition. You've also got some spatial closure to establish the spatial relationship between the characters and their environment. Usually, temporal and spatial closure are the most common, but you'll see some causal and associative transitions every now and then. In this page from Witch Hat Atelier, a towel flies away from these 2 panels, showing a causal relationship as the wind launches the towel into the air. We've also got this page depicting the concept of magic with the metaphor of a book, representing how magic in this world is drawn on paper. All these different types of closure are cool and all, but once again, this new version of categorization is not an exact science either. It's simply a way to help clarify how artists jump between drawing to drawing, and it can help us understand what is really going on in the gutters. When it comes to art, I've heard a saying that putting too much detail is the same as having no detail at all. I love JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but I have trouble reading the non-colored manga because there's so much detail in all the panels that many of them lack enough contrast. It's important to strike a balance to create clarity. In short, less is more. Take a look at this comic strip. It is a bajillion panels long, all to depict someone drunk driving and dying. In the next page, Scott McCloud greatly shortens the length to only 10 panels, keeping only the key events. Then, he shortens it again. And finally, he makes the comic only 2 panels long. As Scott McCloud writes, the art of comics is as subtractive in art as it is additive. You can add as many beautiful panels as you like, but it can bog down the story, and if you have too little, the reader might not receive some vital information. In the shortest version of McCloud's comic, the reader can logically conclude that Carl died because he drove while drunk, but you can't be 100% sure. Even if he did die because of drunk driving, we don't know exactly how. Maybe there was some bad weather and his car swerved. This is just a whole thing that the reader must infer. When an artist draws their panels, they must arrange each image in a way that the reader can form a logical bridge. But this bridge doesn't have to be so rigid that you have to depict every minute action that a person performs. The gutter is elastic. An artist can be deliberately ambiguous, encouraging the reader to come up with their own interpretation of events. For example, Fire Punch has a few scenes that get skipped. Here, in chapter 68, we have Agni versus the masked man, but all we see is a black page before the fight is over. When I first read this scene, I was so angry because I didn't get to see what happened, but I soon realized how amazing this decision was. What our brains can imagine is so much better than anything someone could have drawn. The point wasn't to portray a cool fight, but to show that this confrontation is just another act of violence that ends just as quickly as it began. It mirrors the deterioration of Agni's mental state and the deterioration of the world around him. While this example has a thematic purpose, I'd like to bring back the blank double-page spread from Shaman King. The attack that the main character uses is meant to purify the soul, which could be why everything is white, but I believe the true reason the artist decided to do this is because it's badass. Imagine pulling up with a manuscript showing your main character's ultimate move, but it's so powerful that the pages are empty. The amazing thing about ambiguity is that no senses are involved, which means that all of our senses are involved. It's a weird oxymoron, isn't it? When it comes to what's within the panels, the only senses we're engaging is sight, but in the gutters, the power of imagination takes over. This reader interaction happens multiple times on every page. Then, just before we can stray too far in our own thoughts, the next panel catches us, ensuring that we're still on the right path. It's truly amazing what we can see when we don't see anything at all. Manga and comics are unique from all other art forms because they give so much to the reader while requiring so much in return. It's a give and take relationship, a dance between author and reader. Manga is so much more than a combination of pictures and words. The way these panels are arranged is a form of grammar that can't be replicated anywhere else. So, next time you pick a manga and admire the beautiful art, take some time to get lost between the panels. If you look hard enough, you might find not just blood in the gutters, but a whole, entire universe.
Evil